Joseph Shammy, 70 years before Roosevelt brought in Social Security,
Yeah.
Bismarck brought it in old age.
Much more than 7 years, longer, yeah.
Could you discuss what brought him about for this revolutionary change that's impacting the entire globe now, this old age social insurance?
Yeah. It's a tremendous achievement. And it is, I think, one of the flaws in the book that I don't spend as much time in as I should, and several reviewers have noticed that. Just for those of you for whom this is not household stuff, 1881, in November of 1881, the Kaiser announced that it was the obligation of the state to look after people who were sick, who had been injured at work, and in their old age. And Bismarck introduced the first contributory, compulsory insurance system in the world. And it's still the basic social security system in Germany. They haven't changed it. And he does that in a very typical Bismarckian way. In 1878, he got legislation passed to forbid the Social Democrats as a party. They couldn't organize, although there was a flaw in the law, and they could still run for office, which he was sorry about afterwards. So he's trying to suppress the socialists, and later on, of course, he wanted to use force to suppress them. On the other hand, he always had two strategies. One is to attract people, and the other is to threaten them with force. And whichever he used depended on the circumstances. To take away the insecurity of the working classes and say, when you are old and sick and injured, the state will look after you, struck him, who was not a liberal, as the kind of moral obligation which a good landlord has towards his peasants. And in the description to Moritz Busch, his secretary, says why he does it. Well, he said, if you take the case of somebody who's a servant at court, he's much more biddable because he's got a pension to expect. If we give our workers pensions, they're likely to be much better and not cause so much trouble. So that was the basic motivation. The fact that it turned out to be a permanent and really important change is important. Now, why does it take so long for the United States and Britain to get to them? Lloyd George brings it in 1909, and Roosevelt brings it in with the Depression in the 1930s. Because in liberal states, it's much harder to interfere in the market than it is in an authoritarian state. Bismarck didn't care about the market. He didn't care about liberalism. He wasn't one. So obviously, you impose on the employers, you don't care about them, at cost to keep their workers happy. So I think that's part of the explanation. Does that help?
Oh, boy. There's a reason why I don't put certain things on certain channels. And now, the reason that the video about the case against gay marriage was a private message to Obsidian, and I locked it to where only he could see it, is because of this. Which is why it's private again, is because certain videos belong in certain sections because of the audience. Now, this is for shut-in sessions, okay? He had a rebuttal. Normally, if I'm doing a rebuttal, I'll actually splice in what he said and then what I said. But in this case, I don't think that's necessary because he's the second person that went round and round talking about what a liberal is or what a liberal state is. Now, what we call a liberal in the United States and a conservative in the United States is relative to the United States. OK, but what a liberal state is not relative to the people that are inside it. It doesn't matter that you lynch people. It doesn't matter that you have prejudice, because liberal has nothing to do with a classical liberal state or a liberal state in relation to other countries in the world are different. What a liberal state is, and we call them laissez-faire liberals because we're talking about the freedom of trade and whatnot. But a liberal state is they liberated themselves from the crown. They liberated themselves from kings. or the authoritarian state, where you have a top-down heavy government that's telling you what to do. But that is tradition. I can give the biggest example. I tell people about whether they know whether they live in a liberal state or not is what happens when your bankers steal money. In a liberal state, your bankers get a fine and maybe one or two of them go to jail. In an authoritarian state, they line those bankers up and they put bullets in their head. If you take an authoritarian state like South Korea, who we think is a democratic state, and indeed that's where they list themselves as a democratic state. Remember that time when that barge, that ferry overturned itself, and those people drowned in that ferry? Do you know the people that own that ferry, they're in charge of the ferry, had to flee the country because they had a bullet with their name on it? Authoritarian states do not play. That's an authoritarian state. That would never happen in a liberal state like the UK, France, or the United States. It's a top-down system, just like it was with when you had a king or you had a crown that the liberal states liberated themselves from. United States was a liberal state after the Revolutionary War because it separated itself from who? King George. And after the United States did it, France and England did it. They became liberal states. Germany did not, even though Germany became what we call a democratic state, a quote unquote democratic states, but they were an authoritarian states, especially under Otto Bismarck. You had a top-down system. Industry did not run anything. I'm going to put a clip in about the difference between a Social Security in a liberal state and an authoritarian state. Bismarck was not a liberal. When he said Social Security was implemented, they just did it. There wasn't a question about it. And the corporations and the companies, they paid the cost. Whereas in the UK, France, and the United States, they did it later. Why? They're liberal states. They had to bicker back and forth and decide. Same reason we don't have health care. Germany has had health care since the 19th century. They had health care under Hitler because the authoritarian state told them that's what you're going to have. The same thing in a fascist state. A fascist state only exists inside an authoritarian regime. You cannot have a fascist state under a liberal regime. It's not going to happen. That has nothing to do with slavery. That has nothing to do with the economic system you run under. A mercantile authoritarian state can have slavery. The biggest free trader was the slave states. They believed in laissez-faire free trade, where you had a protectionist north that was quote unquote anti-slavery. But those are two competing systems. That has nothing to do with anything else. That's the difference between a liberal state and an authoritarian state. It's not a conservative state. A real conservative, Putin is a conservative. Saudi Arabia is a conservative state. They're an authoritarian state. Those are the old-fashioned states before 18th and 19th century liberals came upon the scene. But you have to use the terms precisely. You cannot make them up. So when I say a liberal state, I mean something in particular. Now let's get on to what we talked about, gay marriage. Right in the beginning, because I was talking to somebody that knew what the argument was and not in general. That's how come I didn't really want to release the video because it was towards somebody that knew what I was talking about and not for the general population. Because I know that I was going to get people like you and like a couple other people that didn't know what the argument was. You don't know what a liberal state is, so you're guessing. Obsidian knew exactly what I was talking about. Now let's get to gay marriage. How come? What was the argument I said that was against gay marriage? It has nothing to do with what people do with their genitals. The argument is that if you want, the argument is that if you start allowing people into the normal circle, what happens? There's other people that are going to apply. And it's not about the gay people themselves. It's not about the transgender people themselves. Look how liberal countries define rape. You've gone from the forcible act of rape by a stranger to the point where they renamed rape or sexual assault by just looking at people on the street. That's a liberal country. It's not going to happen in an authoritarian country. That kind of crap wouldn't happen in China. You look at the divorce laws in a liberal state where the divorce laws can tear up the marriage contract and put it in family court and change willy-nilly what a divorce is, where they can take a man's stuff or whatever they deem relational because it's not based on a strict guideline. In China, they tried the same thing. Guess what the Chinese did? Did they debate about it? Did they put it in court? Did they argue about it? No. The Chinese said, this is wrong. You can't get married to a guy and take his house. So guess what they did? They just changed the law. Try that in the United States. An authoritarian state says, okay, we want health care for all people. Did they sit up and go back and forth for 20 years debating the doggone thing? No, they said, this is what we're going to do. And they do it. That's an authoritarian state. Liberal states, we've been arguing about health care or universal health care for the past 50 years. You look at the Gulf of Mexico when the driller's pipe broke and started flooding the bay with oil. How long did we debate back and forth before we decided to plug the hole? Authoritarian states, they would just go do it. They would decide what they could do and they would just go do it. The Japanese have public health care. Do you see them arguing about it? Their diet or whatever government they have says this is what we're going to do and it's done. There's no argument about that because Japanese is not a liberal state. In an authoritarian state, they determine what the boundaries are. And they're strict about it. If there's no gay marriage, there's no gay marriage. If you're gay and they allow you to be gay in that country, they don't really care. But you start applying for something and trying to make it law, it's going to get shut down just like it did in Russia. There is no discussion about it. In a liberal state, once you lose your boundaries, it's like herding cats. We can't even determine what the gun laws in this country is because they go back and forth. You have the NRA, you have the gun manufacturers, you got people that are the police that are anti-gun, and we've been going back and forth about this doggone thing for a couple hundred years. It's a liberal state. And once you lose your boundaries in a liberal state, guess what's going to happen? You're going to have a whole lot of other voices talking about what's normal. Where they're marrying your cat is normal, which they've done in Great Britain. Where boys can arbitrarily wear skirts, which has been done also in Britain, which is a liberal state now. You don't hear anything about gender bending or transgender or anything else like that in China. Either it's allowed or it isn't. Even in Japan, either it's allowed or it isn't. The United States has loose boundaries, and it just like Rome, it will tend to decay if you let it go too far. And the thing is, there's nobody, the gays or the transgenders aren't determining what's too far. Who's going to hold the boundaries? Who's going to argue against pedophiles now? Pedophiles have a case. They have a right to live their life the way they want to live it if there's two consenting people. You're worried about who raises children, single family homes. Now you're going to have you're going to have gay people that have the right to adopt children. Now, what kind of mess is going to come out of that when you have leagues and leagues and leagues of legally gay married people raising children? What kind of mess is that going to come out? What kind of mess is going to come out of that? We haven't even started with the ramifications about how that's going to screw up the country. We haven't even started. A year after gay marriage was basically federalized or legalized throughout the country, now we're having fights about bathrooms. And that's just the beginning. We're having fights about who can use the bathroom, which has been already deemed a safety issue, and we're fighting about it. You have the North Carolina that opposes the bathrooms, and you have the NBA ready to move the All-Star game, and that's a year after gay marriage. That's just a year. It's not 20 years. That's just a year. In other words, it's already started to break down. What's next? There's a difference between managing the prejudice between countries, between people inside a country that's gone on for years and years and years, and losing your boundaries altogether. There's certain rules, and there's certain regulations and certain guidelines and certain forms that give you a structure to build a family on. What happens when those structures are no longer there? You've already seen what single parenthood has done. You've already seen what no fault divorce has done. You've already seen what changing the definition of out of wedlock birth or illegitimate children has done. You've already seen what it's done to the country already. The country's already a mess. There is no family structure to speak of. It's already a mess. And now you're adding fuel to the fire. So what's going to happen when you go in to get married, say it's gay marriage or whatever, and there is no gender anymore? What structures are you going to build your family on? What structures are you going to do to raise a child in? A woman has 2-3 kids. That's for instance. Just say for instance, a woman has 2 or 3 kids, and then in somewhere in the middle, she decides, I don't want to be a woman anymore. I want to be a man. I want to live as a man. What happens to the stability of the children? What happens to the stability of the family? What happens to little boys that want to all of a sudden become little girls, or vice versa, before the age of consent? That's what you have now. You have 5-year-old kids, quote unquote, parents are determining what the gender of their child is. And then the gauntlet that child has to run through quote unquote what's left of normal society. Now you're talking about black men are getting killed, and black men are getting lynched, and Mexicans are getting lynched. What do you think happened 100 years ago? Where do you think, how come you don't even understand, right now as a millennial, I'm assuming that you're a millennial, you have no idea what a liberal or conservative is. You have no idea when you walk up to a person what gender they are. If you want to use that format, you walk up to a person, they're displaying as what? Are they displaying as a male, or are they displaying as a female? Is it a male dressed? Is it a male that's been enhanced to be a female? You're already getting transgender. You're already feeding that shit into transgender's head, and you're getting them hurt and you're getting them killed because they're displaying as a female and they want to play that ideal. They want to get into bed with a man, and that man finds out that the dude has a penis. And we're supposed to get caught up into this fantasy like, oh, it's a nice surprise. And then that person gets the shit beat out of them. This shit was killing Rome way back then after Julius Caesar. Caesar Augustus had to completely eliminate all that stuff because guess what they were doing? They were whacking off little boys' balls and penises at the end before puberty and selling them off as wives. What's going to happen when we decay far enough to where you're selling off your kids for sex and there's no penalty, there's no laws, or there's precedences? Case in point, Bill Cosby is going through court cases that go back 50 for things that go back 50 years because guess what? They changed the law and says, okay, you can go back 50 years even though there's no evidence, even though you didn't file any charges at the time. We're going to take your word for it, and we're going to go back and we're going to prosecute somebody for something that happened that may or may not have happened 50 years ago, even though there's no proof. Why? Because there's no legal standard anymore. Because the laws have been so liberalized that there is no standard anymore. And once you like the old saying is, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. And guess what we're doing now? We're falling for anything. Now we're all of a sudden we're redefining what left and right is, or what liberal and conservative is, when it's really, really very clear when you talk to a scholar. That's why the first thing I ask when somebody talks about a liberal country, look up the definition of what liberal is. Most people don't even know. Most people they haven't even heard of when they have to look it up. And if you have to look it up, that means you don't understand it. And that's why the initial video was not for everybody, because I knew I would get this kind of response from people that, with all due respect, that don't know what the fuck they're talking about. And I aimed it at a person that does know what he's talking about. That's how come he never had a problem with it, because he asked for a cogent argument against it, which is why I never released the video in the first place, because I knew I would get people that didn't know what they were talking about. People that have no clue about what a fascist is. They didn't live at that time. They don't read history books. They look up online and says, okay, this is what they say about fascism. I'm going to interpret what they mean. You cannot have fascism without an authoritarian state. Germany was an authoritarian state because they had a Führer. They had a leader. The difference between socialism or democratic socialism and communism, which is basically authoritarian socialism, is that one has a liberal tradition to it and one has an authoritarian tradition to it. China, believe it or not, is basically not quite, but almost a semi-fascist capitalist state. The state determines what industries get ran. Capitalism always runs better under what? Authoritarianism, because it's efficient. Singapore has a minor miracle through capitalism because what? It's an authoritarian state. It's efficient. Anybody that studies history knows that. It's not as good for the society if you were never raised in an authoritarian society. It's gonna grate your nerves. Anyway, this is way too long for a rebuttal. I'm sure I'm at 20 minutes. Yeah, over 20 minutes. Now, normally what they would tell me is that I shouldn't respond to people that basically don't know what they're talking about because it's a waste of time. But since you're one of my subs and you did have a rebuttal, and I said I would respond to you, I'm responding to you. You're talking about fascists and you're talking about non-liberals, and you never even picked up a book. You never even picked up a history book to find out what liberalism came out of in the 18th and 19th centuries. which if you go to BGS books, I do believe I went over it in Tragedy and Hope. You can go there if you can go there. You can go through the whole thing because they talk about liberalism and they talk about authoritarianism. Hitler was nothing else or no more than the remake of Otto Bismarck. The fascism, which is the sticks, the sticks of justice, basically that the Roman Empire used to dispense justice. The fasces, which is the sticks and the axe, which is basically the symbol of fascism, which is something that you will see in Germany as a masthead. Is nothing more than what Otto Bismarck says calls iron and blood. Iron and blood is forging a country in rulership through war and an iron fist. Hitler is nothing more than a remake, or fascism is nothing more than a remake of going back to good old Prussian values and reforging your country through what? Iron and blood. The same thing that Putin did in Russia. Bringing back Peter the Great and Catherine the Great as the Tsar, the strong, iron-fisted Tsar that forged Russia together as a country. But that's a history lesson. I don't know if it's a history lesson that you're aware of or that you're even willing to take, because most people have been brought up in a liberal, feminized schooling system and have liberalized, feminized thought. And you wonder how come there's so many beta males out there. It's because you have been feminized and you have been liberalized to where you don't have any standards anymore. And you wonder how come your relationships and your interactions with the opposite sex don't work. Get called what you guys are atomized individuals. You have no boundaries. You have no standards. You are malleable material for the country or basically the corporations to move around. But that's a discussion for another day. It's way too deep for this particular discussion. Anyway, I'm going to put this up. I don't know how long. If shut-in sessions, you better get to it and rebut whatever you're going to rebut, because I know once I put out, I'm going to get more idiots and yahoos coming in talking about this. And I just took down the other one because I got sick of going back and forth with idiots and yahoos. So with that, I'm going to close this out. This is the response that you asked for. This is BGS